Keep the coat. You need it more than I do." The woman stared at him as snow drifted through the cold Chicago air. Her fingers tightened around the worn brown coat he had just placed over her shoulders. For a moment, she looked as though she wanted to say something. Instead, she simply stood there in silence, her eyes fixed on the man walking away from the bus stop. What she did not know was that the coat had been the last warm thing he owned. What he did not know was that the woman standing beneath the flickering streetlight was a billionaire CEO who had disappeared from her own world. 3 days earlier, Chicago had been locked in the grip of an early winter storm. The wind swept between downtown buildings like an invisible river, pushing icy air through every street and alley. Daniel Carter pulled his jacket tighter as he stepped out of a grocery store carrying 2 small bags. Inside were a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk, and enough food to get through the weekend. It was not much, but it was all he could afford. Every dollar mattered. The rent was due in 6 days. The electric bill sat unopened on the kitchen counter. His daughter Emma needed new winter boots. Yet despite the pressure weighing on his shoulders, Daniel kept moving forward the only way he knew how, one day at a time. A city bus roared past, spraying slush onto the curb. Daniel glanced at his watch. He still had 20 minutes before starting his evening shift at a warehouse loading center. His first job had ended less than an hour earlier. His second was about to begin. Exhaustion had become a permanent companion. As he approached a bus stop near an old brick pharmacy, something caught his attention. A woman sat alone on the metal bench. She wore elegant clothing, but it was completely wrong for the weather. Her white coat was missing. Snowflakes clung to her chestnut brown hair. Her hands trembled as she rubbed them together. Several people passed by without stopping. Others looked away. Daniel slowed his pace. He could have kept walking. Most people did. Nobody would have blamed him. He had problems of his own. Yet something about her expression made him stop. It was not fear. It was not weakness. It was loneliness. The kind that could not be hidden behind money or confidence. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked. The woman looked up, startled. For a second, she seemed unsure how to answer. "I will be fine," she said softly. The wind immediately stole the warmth from her voice. Daniel glanced at the darkening sky. Temperatures were expected to drop below 20 degrees before midnight. He looked at her, then at his coat, then back at her. Without another word, he removed it. The cold struck instantly. The woman shook her head. "No, I cannot take that." Daniel smiled gently. "Sure you can." And before either of them realized it, a simple act of kindness had already begun changing both of their lives. 3 days before that snowy night at the bus stop, Charlotte Hayes had walked away from a life most people spent their entire lives chasing. The headlines called her one of the most influential CEOs in America. Financial magazines placed her on their covers. Business networks analyzed her decisions as if they were predicting the weather. From the outside, her life appeared perfect. Inside, it felt increasingly empty. On the top floor of a gleaming corporate tower in Chicago, Charlotte stood alone in her office, staring at the city below. Thousands of lights stretched toward the horizon. Thousands of people rushed through lives she would never truly know. Her calendar was full. Her company was thriving. Her net worth continued to grow. Yet for the first time in years, she found herself questioning whether success and fulfillment were actually the same thing. Earlier that morning, a board meeting had lasted nearly 4 hours. Executives discussed market expansion. Investors discussed quarterly projections. Advisors discussed public perception. Everyone wanted something from her. Everyone needed a decision. Everyone had an opinion. By the time the meeting ended, Charlotte felt more exhausted than inspired. She returned to her office and sat in silence. No emails. No calls. No assistants. Just silence. The kind of silence that forces a person to hear thoughts they have been avoiding. She opened a drawer and pulled out an old photograph. It showed her standing beside her father many years earlier, long before private jets, long before billion-dollar valuations, long before she became someone the world admired. Her father had often said that wealth was useful, but meaning was essential. At the time, she thought she understood. Now she was not so sure. That evening, Charlotte made a decision nobody expected. She canceled several appearances. She postponed meetings. She handed temporary authority to trusted executives and disappeared without announcing where she was going. No security detail. No corporate entourage. No luxury accommodations. She rented a small apartment under a private arrangement and spent the following days moving through the city unnoticed. For the first time in years, strangers spoke to her without knowing who she was. Some were kind, some were indifferent, some never looked up from their phones. The experience fascinated her. It also revealed something surprising. Despite all her wealth, she felt lonelier than many people who had far less. On the afternoon before the snowstorm, Charlotte spent hours walking through neighborhoods she had never visited before. She watched parents picking up children from school. She watched restaurant workers beginning evening shifts. She watched construction crews packing equipment into trucks before sunset. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. There was something honest about it, something she had been missing. By the time evening arrived, the weather had worsened. Strong winds swept through the city. Snow began falling faster. Charlotte realized she had wandered farther than intended. Her phone battery died. Public transportation schedules were delayed. As temperatures continued dropping, she found herself waiting alone at a nearly empty bus stop. The cold grew sharper with every passing minute. She wrapped her arms around herself and stared into the storm. For the first time in a very long time, Charlotte Hayes felt completely invisible. She had no idea that the next person to notice her would change everything. While Charlotte Hayes was searching for meaning in a life that no longer felt complete, Daniel Carter was fighting a very different battle. His struggle was not hidden behind glass towers or boardroom doors. It lived in overdue bills, long work hours, and the constant responsibility of raising a daughter on his own. Every morning began before sunrise. Every night ended long after most people were asleep. Yet somehow, he kept moving forward. The small apartment he shared with 11-year-old Emma sat above a neighborhood bakery on the west side of Chicago. It was not large, but it was home. The kitchen table doubled as a homework station. The couch occasionally became a guest bed. The refrigerator was rarely full, but there was always enough to make sure Emma never went hungry. Daniel considered that a victory. On the morning before the snowstorm, he stood at the stove making pancakes from a budget mix while Emma sat nearby, finishing a school assignment. The radio quietly played weather reports predicting dropping temperatures and heavy snowfall. Emma looked up from her notebook. "Are we going to be okay this winter?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "Of course we are." She studied him carefully. "You always say that." He laughed softly. "That is because it is always true." The answer seemed to satisfy her, but after she returned to her homework, Daniel glanced toward the stack of unopened envelopes resting on the counter. The rent was late. The electric bill was overdue. One of the tires on his aging pickup truck needed replacement. He did not know exactly how everything would work out. He simply knew he could not afford to give up. After walking Emma to school, Daniel headed to his first job at a hardware supply warehouse. For 8 hours, he unloaded shipments, organized inventory, and moved heavy equipment across concrete floors. When that shift ended, he grabbed a quick sandwich and headed directly to his evening job. The schedule was exhausting, but complaining would not pay the bills. During a short break, one of his coworkers noticed Daniel helping an elderly customer carry several bags to her car. "You know you do not get paid extra for that, right?" the coworker joked. Daniel smiled. "I know. Then why do it?" Daniel shrugged. "Because she needed help." The coworker shook his head and laughed. But Daniel was serious. Kindness had never been a business transaction to him. His father had taught him that character mattered most when nobody was watching. Over the years, those lessons became part of who he was. Later that evening, as snow clouds gathered over the city, Daniel finished his shift and stepped outside into the cold. His coat protected him from the bitter wind, but only barely. It was old, worn, and several winters past replacement. Buying a new one was not possible right now. Emma needed boots first. She always came first. As Daniel walked toward the bus stop, tired muscles aching from another 14-hour day, he thought about getting home, helping Emma with homework, and finding a way to stretch next week's grocery budget. What he did not know was that within the next hour, one simple decision would place him on a path neither money nor planning could have predicted. Snow fell harder as the evening deepened. Streetlights glowed through the storm like distant lanterns, their light softened by swirling white flakes. The city seemed quieter than usual, as though winter itself had pressed a hand over the noise of Chicago. Daniel Carter stood at the bus stop with cold air biting through his clothes. His shift had ended later than expected, and exhaustion weighed heavily on him. All he wanted was to get home to Emma, heat a simple dinner, and spend a few peaceful minutes together before another long day began. Then he noticed the woman sitting alone on the bench. At first glance, she appeared out of place. Her clothing was elegant, her posture refined, yet none of that mattered against the bitter cold. Snow had gathered in her chestnut hair. Her hands trembled slightly despite her efforts to hide it. Several buses had come and gone. Nobody stopped to ask if she needed help. Most people were too busy trying to stay warm themselves. Daniel watched for a moment. Then he looked away. He had his own problems. His bank account was nearly empty. His coat was the only heavy winter coat he owned. Replacing it would cost money he simply did not have. He started walking toward the curb as another bus approached. Then he glanced back at the woman. Something about her expression stopped him. It was not sadness. It was not fear. It was the look of someone carrying a burden nobody else could see. Daniel knew that look. He had worn it himself many times. The bus doors opened. Passengers stepped aboard. Daniel could have left. Instead, he remained where he was. The bus pulled away. Snow continued falling. Finally, he walked over to the bench. "Ma'am, are you sure you are okay?" he asked. Charlotte Hayes looked up slowly. The question surprised her. Not because it was unusual, but because nobody else had asked. "I am fine," she replied. The words sounded polite, but unconvincing. A gust of wind swept through the shelter. Charlotte shivered. Daniel glanced at the dark sky. Temperatures were dropping fast. He thought about Emma. He thought about the rent. He thought about the long walk he still had ahead of him. Then he made a decision. Without hesitation, he removed his coat and held it out to her. Charlotte stared at him. "No," she said immediately. "You need that." Daniel smiled faintly. "Maybe." She shook her head. "I cannot take your coat." "Sure you can." "What about you?" Daniel shrugged. "I will manage." Charlotte looked from the coat to the man standing before her. Nothing about him suggested wealth. Nothing suggested influence. Yet in that moment, he was offering more than many people with unlimited resources ever would. Slowly, she accepted it. The warmth settled around her shoulders. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Charlotte reached into her purse. "Please," she said softly. "At least let me repay you." Daniel stepped back and shook his head. "No need. You do not even know me." His smile widened. "You looked cold." That was enough. And as he turned and disappeared into the snowy night, Charlotte remained seated beneath the bus shelter, holding a worn coat that was suddenly worth more to her than anything money could buy. Charlotte Hayes expected to forget the man with the worn coat. Instead, she found herself thinking about him constantly. The next morning, she sat alone in her temporary apartment, the coat folded neatly across the back of a chair. Sunlight filtered through the window, illuminating every crease in the fabric. It was old. The stitching showed signs of repair. One sleeve had been carefully mended by hand. Yet somehow it felt more valuable than many of the designer jackets hanging in her penthouse closet. She remembered the way Daniel Carter had smiled when she offered to repay him. There had been no hesitation in his refusal, no attempt to impress her, no expectation of reward. The memory lingered. Most people treated kindness like a transaction. Daniel had treated it like a responsibility. Charlotte poured herself coffee and looked at the coat again. A small tag sewn inside the collar caught her attention. Written in faded marker were two simple initials. DC. It was not much, but it was enough to start searching. By late afternoon, curiosity had become determination. Charlotte wanted to return the coat. At least that was what she told herself. The truth was more complicated. She wanted to understand the man who had given away something he clearly needed. Through a combination of patient inquiry and a few discreet conversations with local business owners near the bus stop, she eventually learned his name. Finding him turned out to be easier than expected. Understanding him would be much harder. 2 days later, Charlotte spotted Daniel outside a neighborhood grocery store carrying several bags toward an aging pickup truck. She stepped out of her rental car holding the coat. Daniel looked surprised when he recognized her. "You found me," he said. Charlotte smiled. "Apparently I did." She held out the coat. "I came to return this." Daniel glanced at it, but made no move to take it. "You can keep it for now." Charlotte laughed softly. "You are still doing that." "Doing what?" Acting like giving away your only coat was completely normal. Daniel shrugged. "Maybe it is." Charlotte stared at him. "You really mean that?" "Sure." He loaded the groceries into the truck and closed the tailgate. "You looked like you needed help." Most people would have kept walking. Most people were not standing there. The simplicity of the answer left her momentarily speechless. For years, Charlotte had listened to presentations filled with complex strategies and carefully crafted explanations. Yet somehow this man reduced everything to basic human decency. Before she could stop herself, she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. Inside was enough cash to replace the coat many times over. "Please take this," she said. Daniel immediately shook his head. "No, why not?" "Because I did not help you for money. It is not a payment." "Then what is it?" Charlotte searched for an answer. Surprisingly, she could not find one. Daniel smiled gently and pushed the envelope back toward her. "Use it for someone who needs it." Then he climbed into the truck. As he drove away, Charlotte remained standing in the parking lot holding both the envelope and the coat. For the second time in less than a week, Daniel Carter had walked away from something many people would have gladly accepted. And for the second time, Charlotte found herself wondering if the struggling single father possessed something far rarer than wealth. Charlotte Hayes told herself she was simply returning a favor. That explanation lasted less than a day. The truth became impossible to ignore. She was fascinated by Daniel Carter. Not because he was extraordinary in the way the business world defined extraordinary. He owned no company. He managed no investment fund. He had no influence over markets or headlines. Yet every time she observed him, she discovered a quality that many successful people spent their lives searching for and never found: character. Over the following week, Charlotte remained in her temporary apartment and quietly continued exploring the city. More than once, she crossed paths with Daniel without immediately revealing herself. One afternoon, she saw him helping a young mother lift a stroller onto a city bus. Another day, she watched him return a wallet someone had accidentally dropped outside a convenience store. On a different evening, she noticed him stopping to help an elderly man whose grocery bags had broken in a parking lot. None of these moments were dramatic. Nobody applauded. Nobody recorded them. Daniel simply helped because help was needed. The pattern intrigued her. Most people became generous when they had abundance. Daniel seemed generous despite having very little. One Saturday morning, Charlotte entered a small neighborhood diner and unexpectedly found Daniel sitting in a booth with his daughter. Emma laughed as she described a science project she was building for school. Daniel listened with complete attention, as though nothing in the world mattered more than that conversation. Charlotte chose a table nearby and quietly observed. The interaction revealed something important. Daniel was not pretending to be kind. Kindness was simply part of who he was. Emma eventually noticed Charlotte and smiled politely. Daniel turned and recognized her immediately. "Looks like we keep running into each other," he said. Charlotte smiled. "Chicago must be smaller than I thought." Emma looked between them curiously. "Dad, is this your friend?" The question caught both adults off guard. Daniel laughed softly. "I'm not sure she would call me that." "Maybe I would," Charlotte replied. Emma grinned. "Then you should sit with us." For the next 20 minutes, Charlotte found herself doing something she had not done in years. She relaxed. No executives interrupted. No investors demanded answers. No one cared about quarterly earnings. They talked about school projects, favorite books, and the unusually cold winter. The simplicity felt refreshing. When the conversation ended, Daniel stood to leave for work. Before walking away, Charlotte asked a question that had been on her mind for days. "Why are you always helping people?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "Because somebody helped me once." Charlotte waited. "When my wife passed away, there were strangers who showed kindness when they did not have to. They made difficult days easier. I never forgot that." He smiled gently. "Sometimes people think changing the world requires something huge. Most of the time it is just showing up when someone needs you." After he left, Charlotte remained seated in the diner long after her coffee had gone cold. The answer stayed with her. In boardrooms, people often spoke about legacy. They measured it in numbers, buildings, and accomplishments. Yet sitting there alone, Charlotte began to wonder if real legacy looked more like a worn coat given away on a freezing night, a father encouraging his daughter, or a stranger choosing compassion without expecting anything in return. And for the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. For nearly 2 weeks, Charlotte Hayes kept her secret. To Daniel Carter, she remained simply the woman from the bus stop. To the world, however, her disappearance had become a growing mystery. Financial reporters speculated about her absence. Industry analysts debated whether she was preparing a major corporate move. Executives inside her company managed daily operations while carefully avoiding questions from the media. Charlotte ignored all of it. For the first time in years, she felt no urgency to return. The simple life she had briefly stepped into was teaching her lessons no boardroom ever could. One cold afternoon, Daniel invited her to join him and Emma at a community winter festival held in a local park. Charlotte almost declined. Crowds had never appealed to her. Then she saw the excitement in Emma's face and agreed. The park was filled with families, food vendors, holiday lights, and children racing between activities. Nothing about it was luxurious. Nothing about it was exclusive. Yet the atmosphere felt warmer than many corporate galas Charlotte had attended. As they walked together, she noticed how naturally Daniel treated everyone he met. He spoke to strangers with the same respect he showed friends. He listened more than he talked. He made people feel seen. Charlotte found herself admiring qualities that could not be measured on financial statements. Later that afternoon, while Emma participated in a school competition, an unexpected sound broke through the cheerful atmosphere. Several nearby phones began buzzing simultaneously. A group of people gathered around a news notification. One woman gasped. Another pointed toward Charlotte. Within seconds, whispers spread through the crowd. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten. She already knew what had happened. Earlier that morning, a journalist had photographed her entering a neighborhood diner. The image had reached national media. Her disappearance was no longer a secret. Daniel noticed the sudden change in expressions around them. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Before Charlotte could answer, a man holding a phone approached cautiously. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you Charlotte Hayes?" The question seemed to echo through the winter air. Conversations nearby grew quiet. Daniel looked from the stranger to Charlotte, then back again. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. The moment she had been avoiding had finally arrived. When she opened them, she nodded. Yes. Silence followed. Not shock from the crowd. Shock from Daniel. He stared at her for several seconds. Every memory from the past 2 weeks suddenly rearranged itself inside his mind. The woman at the bus stop. The temporary apartment. The questions. The mystery. None of it made sense before. Now it did. "You are the CEO?" he finally asked. Charlotte nodded again. "I am." Daniel looked away for a moment. Then he laughed softly in disbelief. Charlotte braced herself for anger. For accusations. For frustration. Instead, he simply shook his head. "That explains why you kept trying to give me money." Charlotte could not help smiling. The tension dissolved instantly. "You are not upset?" she asked. Daniel shrugged. "Should I be? I did not tell you the truth." "Eventually you did." Charlotte stared at him. Most people changed the moment they learned who she was. Some became nervous. Others became ambitious. Daniel remained exactly the same man who had handed a coat to a freezing stranger. And in that moment, standing beneath winter lights surrounded by ordinary families, Charlotte realized that what she admired most about Daniel was not his kindness. It was the fact that neither wealth nor status had the power to change the way he saw people. The revelation changed many things, but it did not change Daniel Carter. In the days that followed, reporters continued discussing Charlotte Hayes and her unexpected disappearance. News outlets speculated about her reasons. Financial commentators analyzed every public statement from her company. Yet whenever Charlotte spent time with Daniel and Emma, none of those things seemed to matter. The conversations remained the same. The laughter remained the same. The friendship remained the same. For Charlotte, that consistency felt almost miraculous. One evening she sat alone in her penthouse office for the first time since returning to public life. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls while stacks of reports waited for her attention. Executives had already resumed scheduling meetings. Investors wanted updates. Advisors wanted strategy sessions. The familiar demands of success surrounded her once again. Yet something was different. For years, she had measured value through growth, acquisitions, and market performance. Now she found herself thinking about entirely different things. She thought about Emma's excitement when talking about science. She thought about Daniel helping strangers when nobody was watching. She thought about a worn coat offered without hesitation on a freezing night. The memories carried more meaning than any quarterly report on her desk. A few days later, Charlotte requested a private meeting with Daniel. They met at a small coffee shop near the neighborhood where he lived. Snow still covered parts of the sidewalks. Those signs of spring were beginning to appear. Daniel arrived straight from work. Charlotte arrived with a proposal. After several minutes of casual conversation, she finally placed a folder on the table. Daniel looked at it cautiously. "What is this?" he asked. Charlotte smiled. "An opportunity." He opened the folder and immediately frowned. Inside was information about a new community outreach initiative her company planned to launch. The program would provide mentorship, job training, and educational support for working families throughout Chicago. Charlotte had created a leadership position specifically designed around someone with real experience facing the challenges the program hoped to address. Daniel slowly looked up. "You want me to run this?" Charlotte nodded. "I want someone who understands people, not just numbers." Daniel closed the folder. "Charlotte, I am not qualified for something like this." She laughed softly. "You helped a stranger without asking who she was. You work 2 jobs to support your daughter. You spend your time helping people who can offer you nothing in return. That sounds qualified to me." Daniel remained silent. Part of him wanted to refuse. Accepting help had never been easy. Pride was not the issue. Dignity was. Charlotte seemed to understand immediately. "This is not charity," she said gently. "I would never insult you that way. This is work. Meaningful work. You would earn every dollar." The words settled between them. Daniel thought about Emma. He thought about the long hours, the missed opportunities, and the future he wanted for his daughter. Most of all, he thought about the possibility of making a difference. Finally, he smiled. "I would like to learn more." Relief and happiness flashed across Charlotte's face. It was not the satisfaction of giving someone money. It was something deeper. She had spent years searching for a new beginning. What she discovered instead was a chance to help create one for someone else, while preserving the very thing she admired most about him: his dignity. 6 months later, the first community center opened its doors on the west side of Chicago. What had begun as an idea inside a coffee shop had grown into something real. Families filled the building. Students attended tutoring programs after school. Parents received career training and mentorship. Volunteers moved through brightly lit hallways, helping wherever they could. The project quickly became one of the most successful initiatives Charlotte Hayes had ever supported. Yet whenever journalists asked her why it worked, she always gave the same answer: because the right person is leading it. That person was Daniel Carter. His life looked very different now, but the things that mattered most remained unchanged. He still walked Emma to school whenever possible. He still stopped to help strangers. He still believed that kindness was not something reserved for special occasions. The long nights working 2 jobs had finally ended. The overdue bills were gone. The future no longer felt uncertain. Yet success had not changed him. If anything, it had simply given him more opportunities to serve others. One spring afternoon, Daniel stood inside the community center watching Emma present a science project to a group of younger students. Confidence radiated from her as she explained each step. Daniel smiled quietly. Moments like this reminded him why every sacrifice had been worth it. Across the room, Charlotte watched the scene unfold. She was dressed simply, far removed from the polished image often seen on magazine covers. For a while she said nothing. Then she stepped beside Daniel. "She is impressive," Charlotte said. Daniel nodded proudly. "She gets that from her mother." Charlotte smiled. "And her father?" For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence. Sunlight streamed through the large windows. Children's laughter echoed through the building. The atmosphere felt warm, hopeful, alive. Eventually, Charlotte looked toward Daniel. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. Daniel laughed softly. "The bus stop." "Yes." He considered the question. "Sometimes. What do you think would have happened if you had kept walking?" Daniel glanced around the room. Families were learning. Children were dreaming. Opportunities were being created. "I do not know," he admitted. "But I am glad I stopped." Charlotte lowered her eyes briefly. "So am I." Later that evening, a small celebration was held for the volunteers and families who helped build the program. There were no celebrities, no extravagant decorations, no grand speeches, just ordinary people sharing food, stories, and gratitude. Near the end of the event, Charlotte approached the stage and thanked everyone for believing in the mission. Then she paused. Her gaze settled on Daniel, standing beside Emma near the back of the room. "People often ask me what inspired this project," she said. "The answer is simple: one act of kindness." The room grew quiet. Daniel immediately looked uncomfortable. Emma grinned. Charlotte smiled warmly. A person who had very little chose to give what he could to someone he thought was a stranger. He expected nothing in return. That act reminded me of something I had forgotten. Success means very little if it is not used to help others. Silence settled gently over the room. Not an awkward silence. A meaningful one. The kind that appears when people recognize truth. Daniel looked at Emma. Emma looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked at the worn brown coat displayed inside a small glass case near the entrance of the community center. Nobody spoke for several seconds. They did not need to, because in that quiet moment, everyone understood the same lesson. Kindness given without expectation never truly disappears. Sometimes it simply waits for the right season to become a miracle.